when we look at Jesus, he seems to be kind of relativist too. Whenever we see him at his most angry or his most upset, it's always because people are being hypocritical. So he seems to teach against telling others what to do. You look at the scribes and the Pharisees. Today, Sunday, as I'm recording this, even though I can't go to Mass, what I've been doing is I've been watching live streams of Mass. And the homily is about this blind man who is healed. This is an amazing thing. He's been blind since birth. And Jesus heals him by rubbing mud into his eyes. And what's the reaction to this miracle that Jesus performs? It's not, oh my gosh, I can't believe it. This man who's been blind his entire life can finally see. No, the scribes and the Pharisees, the way that they react to him is, well, hey, today's the Sabbath. You can't be performing miracles. That's considered work. That seems pretty ridiculous to me. And so we get a lot of quotes from Jesus that a relativist should definitely be using, because these seem to be pretty relativist quotes. Judge not lest you be judged, or let him who is without sin cast the first stone. Those kind of throw the idea of action being the significant aspect of the moral act. That kind of seems to be thrown out the window by Jesus. The one thing that I think Jesus is most against, clearly, is hypocrisy, more so than leading a sinful life. Or at least I would assume most people who actually read the Gospels would notice that. Jesus seems to be more against hypocrisy than leading a so-called sinful life. And as the world becomes more progressive, or I guess you could use the term liberal, that's a direct result of development. Developed nations tend to be more progressive and more liberal as they go on. Development seems to lend itself to that. And as a result, you have people who are able to become more tolerant and compassionate in dealing with others. And you see this a lot in the United States. If you're imposing your personal morality, let's say you're a religious person, let's say you're an evangelical Christian, and you want other people in the United States to be living according to your standards, that seems to be kind of intolerant. And so people are going to be pretty displeased with you if you do that. So if we look at all of these things, there is clear evidence as to why somebody would want to be a relativist. So before we move on, I just want to address the idea of Jesus versus relativism. Of course, Jesus is against hypocrisy and intolerance, but that does not necessarily make him a relativist. I want you to think of, his famous idea of if somebody slaps you, turn the other cheek. That again seems like another relativist ideal. But I think, let's say Matthew 18, 15, 16 is something that tends to address this issue of relativism. So what Jesus tells his disciples, if your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you have gained your brother. But if he does not listen, take one or two others along with you, that every word may be confirmed by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. So what Jesus is saying here is not, okay, well, if you do something bad against me, I'm going to bring it up to you, and if you admit that you did something bad against me, you're my friend. And if you don't admit that you did something bad against me, I get to retaliate. Jesus is very much against retaliation, very clearly. But what he does say is bring other people along with you so that they can acknowledge how wrong the situation is. So I guess you could say there is something about the consensus of it all. You have other witnesses who realize that an injustice is happening. But imagine if those witnesses were to come around and say, well, I'm a relativist, therefore I don't necessarily think that's right or wrong. It's going to be disastrous if that were to happen. And so it's close to relativism in the sense that, we tend to think of justice as the opposite of a relativist reaction, because justice says there's an actual wrong that's being done, and we have to provide retribution. Jesus does not seem to be a fan of that type of justice. And so this is really close to relativism, but it's not entirely relativism. This, again, reaffirms this idea that relativism is popular right now because there's something meritable about it, but it's not entirely a great thing. So let's jump into why relativism is wrong. I want you to very briefly go back to the beginning of your notes and let's take a look at that definition of a relativist. I'll be honest with you, I'm kind of disappointed that I don't get to do this with you all in class because I wanted to be sneaky. But last year when we went over this and I had some students who claimed to be relativists, I asked them if they agreed with that definition that they accepted. A relativist is someone who believes that there are no moral rules that apply to all cultures or all people in one culture, and that no country or person should impose their moral rules on any other culture or person. So I asked them if that was acceptable, and those who claimed to be relativists said, yeah, I would agree with that. Here's how I was sneaky. Here's how I caught them. That claim is self-contradictory. Relativism is self-contradictory. It claims that on one hand, there are no moral rules that are universal or apply to everyone. But at the same time, if you disagree with that, that's amoral. Do you all see the contradiction here? If you think that there is no right or wrong, and somebody, let's say, does want to impose their morality on you, you're probably going to say, hey, don't do that to me. Or let's say they impose it on somebody else, you're going to say, hey, don't do that to that other person. Well, now you're imposing your morality on that person. If something is self-contradictory by nature, it can't stand. And this is why relativism is such an issue. It would be wonderful if what was right and wrong for me was not the same right or wrong for you. But we don't live like that. If you go back to the analogy of the basketball game, there are some times when rules are absolutely necessary, and therefore relativism has to be set aside. Cultures work the exact same way, and I'm not talking about all cultures or all cultures within the world. I'm talking about individual cultures not being relativist. When you think of cultural relativism, it's kind of only a product of Western culture. It doesn't seem to exist anywhere in the East. So imagine, somebody walking down the street in a full burqa. That's a woman who's walking down the street in a full burqa that's covering everything except for her eyes. You probably won't give it much of a thought. Maybe you would, but it's not a huge deal because we live in the United States where people have different senses of styles, different senses of fashion, different religions, different expressions of those religions. It's not a big deal to you. But imagine you were a woman walking down the streets of let's say, Tehran, Iran, wearing hardly any clothes. It's not going to work that same way. This is really a Western thing. And I'm not saying that because it's Western, it's a good thing, or those people in Iran should not have that mentality. I'm just simply stating this seems to be the case. On top of that, if you were going to say, well, relativism is just a Western thing, but I'm a relativist, I'm completely wrong on this, but I feel like it's making the claim that Western culture is superior to Eastern culture if you think relativism is the way to go. And maybe you do think that, but if you're a relativist, you shouldn't be thinking that because everything's either the same or it's nothing. The more you dive into the idea of it, or the concept of relativism, the more its self-contradiction comes to the surface. Another issue I wouldn't say it's necessarily a completely relativist idea, but I'm sure it's very popular among relativists, and I'm sure it's very popular among teenagers. Whatever is the more popular idea is probably the right idea. This is kind of the foundation of democracy. I think most of you acknowledge that just clearly isn't the case, but it's still the way that we operate. If everybody is saying something, if everybody is making a quote-unquote truth claim, doesn't that make that claim actually true? Well, maybe, but what if you have two sides arguing different points of the same thing, and they are split completely down the middle, 50-50. You have 50 people saying one thing, 50 people saying the other thing. You can't really say that popularity is going to dictate the truth, because you've got it split down the middle. In fact, if there's even one person who contradicts the truth, there's something about that at least makes me uncomfortable. Is that because they just want to reject the truth, or is there something about this truth claim that is not actually true? I also think that when it comes to relativism, applied relativism, we will very soon decide to ignore it or forgo it for ourselves. Here's a great example of this. There was a man who bought, I think, $20,000 worth of toilet paper and hand sanitizer, and he just stored it in his garage. And his hope was that he could sell it for a higher price on Amazon. That's how he makes his money usually, is he buys things wholesale and then he resells them on Amazon for a higher price. He did this at the peak of the coronavirus outbreak. What is your immediate reaction to that situation? Do you think, all right, well, oh well, that's his prerogative. He gets to decide to do that. Or is there a part of you that's like, wait, he should not be doing that. There's something wrong with that. Turns out he can't return it for a refund on Amazon, or at those stores, and now Amazon has barred him. Sounds like there was justice involved there. Are you glad that happened? See, we have a desire to seek out and enforce justice. And if you have that desire, you're acknowledging that there is a right and a wrong. That cannot mesh with the idea of relativism. I think the reason why relativism is so popular among young people is because there is a real aversion to supposed intolerance among young people. Again, I think that's a great thing. I think intolerance is a bad thing. So in the notes, I use the word respectful. Think of tolerant. Tolerance is another word that I would use there. To be tolerant is to be compassionate, to have compassion for somebody. But to be compassionate does not mean that when you see someone doing something wrong, you continue to allow them to remain in that situation that's harmful to them, either emotionally, spiritually, or physically. To call someone out when they're doing something wrong is not intolerant. It's helping them overcome their own inabilities. It's a good thing. I see a lot of young people move towards relativism because of this aversion to intolerance. And that can be kind of dangerous. But just realize that, again, being respectful and being compassionate does not mean that you have to tolerate bad things. There's nothing wrong with knowing what is right and knowing what is wrong.